Detroit was cold that day, in weather and in spirit. On a street corner worn by time and silence, a homeless veteran held a handwritten sign with words that would ignite a storm across the nation. What began as an unexpected confrontation with Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett quickly became a national mirror, reflecting who we listen to, who we ignore, and what we choose to fight for. He had lost everything. She was trying to change everything. And when their worlds collided, something none of them expected was born. Not a fight, but a transformation. This is the story of two voices, one muffled by war, the other amplified by power, meeting in the rawest way under the indifferent skies of Detroit. Join me in this real and moving story that will touch your heart, challenge your perspective, and stay with you long after it's over. Comment below. Where are you watching from? Jasmine Crockett adjusted her coat against the Michigan wind as she stepped out of the black sedan. The streets of Detroit were restless, lined with boarded-up shops, fast food wrappers tumbling like dry leaves, and the ghost of industry lingering in the rust. It was February, and cold crept into every crack of the sidewalk and the soul. She was here to speak at a community town hall about housing reform and veteran support, a passion issue, sure, but also a political landmine. Her team had warned her, Detroit doesn't need more promises. It needs people who listen. What Jasmine didn't know was that someone was waiting. Across the street, a man stood with a hand-painted cardboard sign that read, Congresswoman Crockett, you talk housing, I sleep on concrete. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't begging. He was just standing, eyes steady, a thin blanket wrapped around his shoulders, his boots worn beyond their service. Jasmine paused. Her assistant leaned in. Ignore him. We're late. But something in her stopped. Maybe it was the rawness in his voice when he finally spoke. Ma'am, you talk like you know what struggle is. Do you know mine? The cameras caught it. All of it. That moment, unscripted, uncomfortable, real, went viral within hours. Headlines screamed, Homeless vet confronts Congresswoman, and she responds. A new kind of debate. On the streets, not the floor. But this wasn't about social media. Not for Jasmine. That night, she sat alone in her hotel room, replaying his voice over and over. Who was he? And what made his pain land deeper than any question she'd faced on Capitol Hill? Because beneath the confrontation wasn't defiance, it was desperation. And for Jasmine, something cracked open that day. Not her political stance, her heart. The next morning, Jasmine Crockett did something unusual for a sitting congresswoman. She went looking. No press, no team, just her, in jeans and a wool coat, walking block after block through the gray pulse of Detroit. The man wasn't at the shelter. He wasn't near the soup kitchen either. The only lead was from a woman named Joyce, who ran a food truck near Jefferson Avenue. You mean Deshaun? Quiet guy, served overseas. He's been out here a while. Doesn't ask for much, just stands. That was the first time Jasmine heard his name, Deshaun Miles. A Gulf War vet, discharged with PTSD, fell through the cracks of the VA system, lost his job, then his home, then his wife and daughter, who moved to Atlanta to start over. What was left was a man the system had forgotten, but not broken. When Jasmine finally found him again, he was sitting behind an abandoned bus terminal, sketching in a tattered notebook. You came back, he asked without looking up. You didn't ask for a photo op. You asked me a question, she replied, stepping closer. And I didn't answer. Didn't expect you to. Well, here I am. He looked at her, eyes heavy but clear. Then sit. She did, right there, on the frozen steps of a forgotten city. No cameras, no press, just two people, one in office, one out of everything, talking. He spoke slowly, like a man who had learned silence too well. She listened differently this time, not like a politician checking off boxes, but like a woman learning what pain sounded like without a microphone. Jasmine's phone buzzed constantly. Staff, news alerts. This is blowing up, they said. Your numbers are climbing. But for the first time, she didn't care. That night, Jasmine asked her team to organize something radical, a live-streamed public forum. Not in a Capitol building, but right there in Detroit. And she wanted Deshaun to sit beside her. He's not a prop, she told them. He's the story we keep skipping. They pushed back. It's risky. She replied, "It's necessary." But not everyone was pleased. By morning, conservative media was calling it a sympathy stunt. Others questioned if she was exploiting the situation. Donors called. Warnings were issued. And Deshawn? He hadn't said yes. He didn't trust Easy anymore. The community center in East Detroit hadn't seen this kind of crowd in years. Fold-out chairs lined the gym floor. Cameras perched awkwardly between pillars. Outside, local volunteers handed out hand warmers and black coffee. It was cold, but not just in temperature. There was tension in the air. A tension made of doubt, hope, and the weight of a single question. Would he show up? Jasmine sat near the front, flanked by local activists and housing advocates. She kept glancing toward the entrance. Deshawn hadn't responded in 2 days. Not to calls, not to messages relayed through Joyce. And now, with half of Detroit watching online, it felt like a hole had opened in her plan. Then, just as a local poet finished his reading, the door creaked open. No fanfare, no que, just Deshawn in that same long coat, carrying his notebook. He walked slowly to the front. Jasmine rose instinctively. She didn't hug him. She just nodded with something softer than gratitude in her eyes. Respect. "I'm not a speaker," he said into the mic, voice low but steady. "But I got words." What followed silenced even the most skeptical journalists in the room. Deshawn didn't tell a sob story. He read from his notebook, fragments of memory, journal entries from nights sleeping under overpasses, thoughts about war, about coming home to a country that forgot him. One entry was titled, "Veterans don't die in combat. They die in silence." People cried quietly. Some took off their hats. Jasmine sat frozen, a lump in her throat. And then Deshawn did something that cracked the room wide open. He turned to her. "You showed up, Jasmine. Not with promises. With ears." And that, he tapped his chest, that means something. It wasn't scripted. It wasn't strategy. It was trust, offered cautiously like a gift. And it came with a condition. "I'll keep speaking if it leads to doing. No photo ops. No headlines. Just one question. Can we fix what's broken without using people like bricks in a speech?" Jasmine stood up. "We don't fix anything without you. Or people like you." That night, #Deshawn Speaks trended nationally. But with visibility came heat. The backlash grew fiercer. Critics questioned Jasmine's judgment. Some veterans groups applauded. Others were offended. And back in D.C., her staff warned her, "This changes everything. You'll lose some support." She looked at them and said, "Then maybe I didn't need it." The flight back to Washington, D.C. was quiet. Jasmine stared out the window, replaying Deshawn's words again and again. Not because they were eloquent, though they were, but because they stripped something away. The performance, the distance, the comfort. She arrived at the Capitol to find her office in a storm. Emails, voicemails, calls from senior Democrats, messages from party leadership urging her to refocus. The whispers were growing. She's going off script. Too emotional. She's aligning with unpredictable elements. In a private meeting, a senior aide confronted her. "You're gambling your reputation on one man's story." "No," Jasmine replied, eyes steady. "I'm exposing how many stories we've buried." But conviction didn't protect her from fatigue. She started losing endorsements. A key housing committee seat she'd lobbied for was quietly handed to someone else. And worst of all, an amendment she'd written on transitional housing for veterans was stalled without reason. That night, she went to the church around the corner from her D.C. apartment. Not for politics, for peace. There, in the silence of the pews, Jasmine prayed. Not for power, but for clarity. Was this fight still hers to carry? The next morning, a package arrived at her office. No return address. Inside, a notebook. Deshawn's. On the first page, a note. "If you're going to speak for us, you got to know us. Keep these stories safe." She cried right there at her desk. Later that week, Jasmine returned to the House floor. Not with a speech, but with a proposal. She introduced the Deshawn Miles Act, a bill focused on streamlining mental health services, housing transitions, and employment pathways for homeless veterans. The press called it symbolic, but Deshawn called her. "You're doing it." "I am. Even if it doesn't pass. Especially if it doesn't. Then I'll speak again." And he did. Together, they launched a series of community listening sessions, Detroit, Dallas, Baltimore, and Atlanta, where veterans, homeless citizens, and social workers shared stories that had never been aired, never been archived. Jasmine didn't speak much at those meetings. She sat, she listened, she wrote, because now she understood. The truest form of representation wasn't speaking louder. It was hearing deeper. The rotunda was full. The U.S. Capitol buzzed with reporters, aides, and restless lawmakers flipping through thick folders. Jasmine stood near the podium, her pulse calm, but her breath shallow. The Deshaun Miles Act had made it to the floor for debate, for vote. She had 20 minutes to speak. Outside, protests simmered on both sides. Veterans holding signs that read, "Miles deserve more," stood next to political opponents accusing her of emotion-based policy. Talking heads were already dissecting her career in real time. But Jasmine wasn't here to survive headlines. She adjusted the mic and looked out across the chamber. Her voice came low, clear. "I come from a place where people disappear, not by death, but by neglect." Deshaun Miles didn't die in combat. He died in line, waiting for help that never came. And so did thousands like him. I ask you today, is silence patriotic? Is suffering invisible until it's polished for campaign ads? Gasps, murmurs. The C-SPAN feed lit up. This isn't a liberal plea. It's not a conservative attack. It's a question about who we claim to be. When the people who protected this nation return home to find we've locked the doors behind them. She paused. You may not like my tone. You may not agree with my politics. But if we can't pass a bill that simply listens and responds to veterans, then we've failed them twice. And then she did something unexpected. She stepped back and let Deshaun speak. The gallery had granted him a special moment. He wore a simple black blazer, no medals, just the truth. I didn't come here to beg. I came here to remind you. I am the consequence of your delay. I am not a symbol. I am your citizen. His voice cracked, just once, but it echoed like thunder. When the vote began, Jasmine didn't watch the screen. She closed her eyes, counted each second like a prayer. The final tally, 211 to 218. The bill had failed. Gasped again, but no surprise. Deshaun didn't flinch. Neither did Jasmine. Later that evening, at a small press conference, a journalist asked her, "How do you feel, Congresswoman?" She smiled. Not with victory, but something harder, resolve. The vote lost, but the silence is broken. Washington moved on fast. By the following week, new headlines dominated the cycle. International tensions, budget disputes, and midterm strategies. The Deshaun Miles Act faded into legislative archives, another lost vote in a city full of forgotten bills. But not everywhere. In Detroit, something had shifted. Churches and libraries began hosting open forums inspired by the listening sessions Jasmine and Deshaun had started. Veterans, for the first time in years, were showing up, not for services, but to speak. And people were listening. A group of young organizers launched the Miles Network, a grassroots project pairing young law students with unhoused veterans to help navigate legal barriers. Jasmine's own office helped fund it quietly, out of pocket, with no press release. Deshaun didn't disappear either. He stayed in Detroit, still sketching, still scribbling in worn notebooks. But now he also taught. On weekends, he met with teens in underserved neighborhoods, talking about trauma, resilience, and how to speak without apology. One of his drawings, a portrait of Jasmine, eyes closed, head bowed, was selected for a local art exhibit. Beneath it, his caption read, "She listened." That was enough to begin. In D.C., Jasmine's approval numbers dipped, but only temporarily, because slowly, something stranger happened. Other representatives, quietly, cautiously, began asking her for guidance. How did you organize those sessions? Where did you get the data? Could we try something similar in our district? And so the legislation didn't die. It simply fractured and seeded. 6 months later, a bundle of smaller bills, veteran health access, mental health prioritization, transitional housing vouchers, passed with bipartisan support. None bore Deshaun's name, but Jasmine knew the truth. So did he. One evening, they met again. No cameras, just a bench near the old terminal in Detroit where it all started. You know, Deshawn said, I still think about that sign I held up. Jasmine smiled. I think about the man who held it. You still fighting? Every day. Then I'm still drawing. No victory speeches. No dramatic finales. Just two people, different worlds, same war, still showing up. A year passed. Detroit thawed into spring, the kind where flowers push through cracks in sidewalks, stubborn and bright. And near the rebuilt bus terminal, now part of a transitional housing project, an engraved plaque was mounted beside a bench. It read, dedicated to every voice that refuses to vanish. Beneath it, two names, Jasmine Felicia Crockett and Deshawn Miles. Jasmine visited quietly. No press, no entouraje, just a morning walk between commitments. She ran her fingers over the cool steel of the plaque and then sat, breathing in the city's sounds. Loud, layered, alive. She thought of everything that had happened since that cold February day. Her fight had changed, not weakened, just deepened. Her politics had sharpened. Her spirit at times had frayed, but she had found a kind of truth more lasting than any bill. People don't need perfect leaders. They need honest ones. Deshawn didn't come to D.C. again, but they spoke often, sometimes by call, sometimes just through notes. Once, he mailed her a small charcoal sketch of a figure standing in the rain, holding a sign that said, "Still here." She kept it framed above her desk. Back in Texas, her re-election campaign leaned into something new. Less polish, more presence. She started live streaming unscripted Q&A sessions with constituents. No filters, no rehearsed talking points, just raw conversation. And it caught on. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room anymore, but maybe the most listened to. And Deshawn, he published a book, not a memoir, a collection of street poems and sketches. It was called Concrete Prayers, and in the dedication, he wrote, "For those who think silence is survival, your story still speaks." On the last page, a quote from one of their conversations. "We weren't meant to be symbols. We were meant to be signals." Detroit didn't forget. Neither did Jasmine, because sometimes change doesn't look like a landslide vote. Sometimes it looks like a worn notebook passed across a room, a chair pulled out in a town hall, a hand reaching across silence. And sometimes it sounds like a man with nothing left to prove saying, "I'm still here." In a world where noise often drowns out truth, this story reminds us that real change begins when we choose to listen, truly listen. Jasmine Crockett didn't just fight for a bill, she fought for a voice. And Deshawn reminded us all that even silence carries power. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel for more human stories that inspire. And tell us in the comments, which moment surprised you the most? We're listening.